Good evening. Welcome to our special event this evening with three speakers. Actually, we'll have one speaker, Guy, first will present, and then the other two authors, who I'll introduce in a minute, will be up front and they'll answer the Q&A. Our speakers this evening are Christine Lipsmeyer, Andrew Phillips, and of course Guy Whitten. They'll be discussing their new book, The Politics of Budgets, Getting a Piece of the Pie. I'm Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs here at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. Dr. Lipsmeyer is a professor in the political science department here at Texas A&M. A common theme in her research is a focus on understanding the political dynamics in established democracies since World War II. Andrew Phillips is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Colorado Boulder and a research fellow at the University of Colorado's Institute of Behavioral Science. His research agenda also has a large methodological component with interest in machine learning, time series, panel, and compositional data. Guy Whitten, of course, is the Cullen McFadden Professor and Department Head of Political Science at the Bush School at Texas A&M. He is the director also of Texas A&M's European Union Center, although, are you stepping down from that guy? Yeah, you are, because I think we met the new director. Yeah. Much of his published research has involved cross-national comparative studies of the influence of economics on government popularity in elections. So write your card, you'll be given cards, you can write your questions on it, and then I'll ask afterwards. Let me just tell one story. What Guy has done is created, and his colleagues, a model for looking at how advanced industrial democracies budget and how they make budgeting decisions. So I'll just tell you one interesting, well, it's interesting for me. So when I was the head of our foreign aid agency under Bush 43, the United States Agency for International Development. And after I retired and went to teach at Georgetown, there was an event. The chairman of the House Foreign Ops Committee that controls the budget for USAID and the State Department, Nita Lowey was her name. She's actually a wonderful person, school teacher for many years in Congress, like 30 years. She's very focused on education and our aid programs, which is very legitimate. I mean, it's a very good program, it's very important. But sometimes the people on the Hill don't understand that if you have a cap on spending, which they did have, if you cut one thing, if you increase one budget too much, you have to cut somewhere else. And they actually left it to the State Department to make the cuts, which was not fun because some of the spending was required by law. You can't cut that. So what they ended up doing, so what she did was she increased by 800% spending on education. They went from 150 million to 700 or 800 million. I can't remember the exact statistics. This was 15 years ago. And the only thing they could cut was what's called the CGIAR, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, which was set up in the late 60s to institutionalize the Green Revolution. Dr. Norman Borlaug from Texas A&M won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1970 for creating the Green Revolution and is credited in his obituary for saving, some people estimate, 1 billion people's lives. A conservative estimate is 300 million people's lives by inventing high-yield dwarf varieties of wheat, corn, rice, and other crops as well. And this institution has tens of thousands of employees at 17 research centers around the world, and they spend around $800 to $900 million. And they invent or they breed crops for poor people in the developing world. Actually, it helps us here too. Apparently, some of the crops we grow in the United States are using this seed that was developed for the poor countries in the South, but we're using it too. In any case, Dr. Borlaug, who was a friend of mine, you don't annoy Norman Borlaug. Even though he was 92 when it happened, he went ballistic because they wiped out the U.S. government's funding for the CGIAR, which was extraordinary because we were the largest donor to it and helped invent it. And he started a worldwide campaign to attack Washington. I don't remember I remember the op-ed in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, but he went, and Congress, when you got Norman Borlaug beating you up, they had a special session of Congress just to pass a special appropriation to restore the budget. But what they had not thought of was exactly what Guy's research and this book deals with, which is what happens when you cut one area. They call them trade-offs, but there's the career officers and aid used to use specific language to describe this very complex system of budgeting. So I'm going to introduce Guy now. What will happen? He will speak first. Then we'll all come up on the stage and answer questions. They will answer questions. I will ask the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and I really appreciate this event being put on by the Scowcroft Institute and the museum and theater. It's great to be back in here. Before COVID, we had a lot of great events in here for the EU Center, and I introduced a lot of people, but this is my first time actually talking in here, so it's very special for me. The book, as Andrew says, the politics of budgets, getting a piece of the pie, and what we're going to do is try to give an overview of what we were up to in this book. And it all starts with the idea that, of course, budgets are very political, and this Obama quote is a good example of that, calling it that it's more than just numbers on a page. It's the embodiment of our values. Angela Merkel, this is from an article in The Economist. Chancellor Angela Merkel announced plans to cut Germany's national deficit, setting off waves of speculation about potential trade-offs driven by budgetary competition. She chose investment over redistribution that resulted in cutting benefits while largely sparing business subsidies. These are the types of choices that we talk about, trade-offs that we talk about when we're looking at journalistic accounts of what's going on in government budgeting processes, when you hear people tell stories about budgeting processes that they were involved in, and it's always about trade-offs. And surprisingly, in the academy, a lot of the research that had been done before we wrote this book is not so much about trade-offs. And so we want to kind of explain some of why that is the case, and it's really the main motivation that we did to write this book. And of course, there's been an absolute deluge of work done in political science, economics, and public policy departments around the world on political budgeting. And so why did we decide to write this book? Basically, we saw an opportunity. Christine and Andy and I did. We actually started this while Andy was still a PhD student. It took a while to write, but it'll count towards his promotion for full professor. But basically what we saw was an opportunity to develop theories and test them, but theories that take account of the big complicated picture of political budgeting, and that do so in a way that's closer to what the people that have been involved in these processes always tell us, and so to look at these trade-offs. And in doing so, we're taking advantage of some recent developments in statistical modeling techniques, including some that were developed here at Texas A&M in a group called the Dynamic Pie Group, and that's why we had to have Getting a Piece of the Pie and then the cover art on this book. And this is a group that Andy and Christine and I are members of. So spoiler alert, this is our entire theory, and our entire book can be summarized in this one picture. This is the roadmap of what we do in our book, both in terms of theoretical developments and statistical modeling. You know, we're going to explain the smaller pieces of this map. We'll actually start at the bottom, and then we'll talk about the top. And down here on the bottom, we'll talk about budgetary components, three of which should be very familiar: total expenditures, total revenues, and budget deficit. And we'll measure those all as a percentage of GDP. And then we'll talk about a measure that's been used by both economists and political scientists called budgetary volatility. And that's directly linked to these expenditure compositions that we'll talk about second in our modeling of those. And hopefully make these very complicated models come to life a little bit. And I think in any statistical modeling exercise like this, it's very important to keep in mind that it is an exercise. And I always like to go back to this quote from George Box, who was the most famous statistician of the 20th century, developed the Box-Jenkins model of time series, and you know, this very simple quote: "All models are wrong, but some models are useful." And what this underscores is that all models are wrong because they're simplifications, and you have to make assumptions in the building of theoretical and statistical models. But we certainly keep that in mind, and we expect later scholars to come around and hopefully, in the best case scenario, they'll find flaws with what we did. The worst case scenario is, of course, they ignore it. But to be criticized is to be heard in the academy, and so we're putting this book out there, and we hope that it ends up serving as an important stepping stone to bridging the gap between what happens in the real world and how we theorize and test our models of political budgeting. So with that in mind, this graph, anything that's in a color, the colors don't really convey that much, but this is the universe that we're studying. So it's basically mostly developed Western European democracies, and then United States, Canada, well, I think Canada actually is in there, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And it's from 1975 to 2010, and most of our decisions about which data to include were based on data limitations, and this is actually pretty good coverage for a study of this type. You want the data to be believable and comparable across countries and over time. But it is really important to keep in mind that any interpretations of our results are limited by the countries and years that we cover. So there's nothing in here about COVID, or we have one Donald Trump slide, but no Donald Trump data, and you know, it's just kind of worth mentioning this as a caveat as we get rolling. So this is the only equation that I'm going to put in the talk that we're going to have in the presentation today, and this is you know, this sort of what we would think of as a fundamental fact about political budgeting, that you know, deficits are equal to expenditures minus revenues, and if deficits are negative, they're budget surpluses. And this is pretty true when you're working with your own checkbook at home, but let me assure you, with government data, that is not true. And you know, there's a lot of complications due to accounting conventions in terms of where and when certain types of transactions are reflected in budgetary aggregates. But what has been done in a lot of the models of these, what we call budgetary components, has been models of a single part of that component. And so here's an example of the four things that we call budgetary components: expenditures, revenues, and deficit. All three of those are as a percentage of GDP. And then the budget volatility, which I'll talk about in just a second. And this is the plot for Finland over the period that we cover in the study. And the big action in the middle is during the fall of the Soviet Union, and basically Finland did a lot of their trading with the Soviet Union, and they were massively affected by the political and economic events that took place. And as I said, despite the fact that we tend to think that the everybody but the upper left-hand corner, that they kind of move in lockstep together following that equation that I just showed you, what a lot of statistical models have done is looked at just one of these graphs and looked at them either across a long time series for a single country or across multiple countries, but always keeping to that one single indicator. And we can certainly learn a lot about those models, but it ignores the interlinked nature of these indicators. So now, to explain budgetary volatility, I know of papers by a few different political scientists and economists. I think this is the most famous one by Drazen and Brender. What they do is they take the categories of spending, and in this example, we're looking at data from the UK, and we can see that there's some changes over the time period in the different categories of spending. But what they're doing is in a single measure, they're summarizing the either year-on-year change or the changes over 4 years. And they're looking at this in a way that the positive and the negative changes don't cancel each other out. They're just making an aggregate of change. So those are just summaries of how much budget volatility there was in the United Kingdom across time. And so that's one of our other measures. And it does come directly mathematically from the 8 expenditure categories together. Okay, so what we're doing differently in the beginning is we're allowing all of these things, we're allowing for the possibility that all these things cause each other. And so we have, theoretical reasons for thinking about why they would be related to each other. And at the same time, we also want to allow external factors and politics to affect each one of these on their own. And then what we're trying to do is to bring all these things together in one model. And it's a very complicated model, but it's a model that allows you to allow for the possibility that these components are causing each other. The causality can flow both ways, or it can flow one way, and by a process known as Granger causality testing, named after the late Clive Granger, winner of a Nobel Prize in economics, we were able to find that these are actually the relationships that are supported. And you can see there's 2 of them with a solid line, which is that total expenditures exerts, we found evidence of a causal relationship between it and budget deficits. And then we found a relationship from budget deficits to total revenues, and a kind of borderline relationship from total revenues back to budget deficits. So what we then did to try to bring the results of these are tables after table of mathematical results. We did some post-estimation simulations to try to bring these things to life, and I'm going to show a few of these types of figures. So this first one, I'll try to explain it in a lot more detail than otherwise. So here we're looking at the effects of one standard deviation, so a typical change, in this case an increase in expenditures on deficits, and we found that there is in fact a relationship when expenditures go up, deficits go up, and that's not too shocking. But the horizontal axis is the size of the effect, and these are in percentage points of GDP. So 2 is 2% of GDP in whichever country you're thinking of, and then we have a line showing 0, and the actual effects are these lines around the blue dots and the green triangles. And if these are what we call confidence intervals, and if they cross the 0 line, then that means that they're not statistically significant. And so what we're seeing here is that all these effects are statistically significant, and then parsing them out a little bit more, the green ones are short-run effects, and the blue ones are long-run effects. And in terms of short-run, long-run, this is in the year that the change takes place, and then this is about 5 years after the change has taken place. And we can see we have the estimated effects for a government from the left that has a majority in their lower house. So if we were talking about the United States, we'd be talking about the House. So they would be a left-wing president with whose party controlled a minority of the seats in the legislature, left majority, right minority, right majority. And the artificial but really useful nature of a figure like this is that we're saying what would these effects be for these 4 different government scenarios, holding everything else constant. The only thing that changes is that we have this increase in expenditures. And of course we know that in the real world everything's changing all at once. But through the statistical machinery that we're working with, we're able to isolate it in these post-estimation simulations. And what you can see is that the short-run effects are pretty big, so close to 6% of GDP, and then the long-run effects are still positive and pretty big, in the neighborhood of about 3% of GDP, but they're smaller. And this is a very typical thing that we see with financial series. When there's a big shock, some of that shock will wear off, but you'll still end up with a long-run effect. So that's what we're seeing in terms of the mapping from expenditures on deficits. Then here is the estimated effect of the increase in revenues on deficits. And not too surprisingly, when revenues go up, deficits go down, holding everything else constant or keeping everything else the same. And again, we see very similar patterns across these 4 different government scenarios. So they're really not big political differences in the overall estimates from these models. And again, we can see the short-run effects are bigger, about a 4% decline in deficits as a percentage of GDP, but then the long-run effects dissipate a little bit, and they're a little bit different from each other, but these differences are not statistically significant. So all governments seem to have the same types of reactions, regardless of their ideology. Okay. So I'm not going to show you all of the figures unless somebody wants to see them during the Q&A. We have most of the other figures in there. I'm just going to kind of summarize what some of the other main findings were in this analysis of the different budgetary components. For total expenditures, one thing that we found was that when unemployment goes up and there's a left-wing majority government, we found a significant short-run positive effect, but not a significant long-run effect. So unemployment goes up, left-wing government increases total expenditures in the immediate time, but it doesn't last. For total revenues, when economic growth goes up and there's a left-wing majority, we found a long-run positive effect, no short-run effect. For deficits, when economic growth goes up and there's a majority government of either left or right, we found a long-run positive effect. economic growth, and this was a real puzzler to us, under either the left or the right, economic growth actually leads to bigger deficits in the long run. And we think it's this wasn't something we expected based on our theory, but doing kind of Monday morning quarterbacking, that one possible explanation for this is that it's easier to spend more on things than it is to cut back. And I think that actually makes a fair amount of sense. And then with budgetary volatility, we found that unemployment has a big effect on left-wing majority governments, and we found that to be significant in both the short and the long run, that unemployment goes up, the volatility of their spending is statistically significantly increased. That's kind of the main points of the components analysis, and so that's kind of what we found down here. And then turning to up here, and thinking about the effects of government ideology on expenditures across policy areas, and this is an area where they're really the bulk of research on political budgeting has looked at the effects of different factors on spending, but it's done it one category at a time. And so I'll show you some examples of that. But first, let's kind of get some of the some quotes just for fun. This is from the OMB publication in 2018. The defense and public safety spending increases in this budget are offset and paid for by finding greater savings and efficiencies across the federal government. Our blueprint insists on $54 billion in reductions to non-defense programs. Then we have Margaret Thatcher. This is actually looking back. She says, as Prime Minister between 1979 and 1990, I had the opportunity to put these convictions into effect in economic policy. We intended policy in the 1980s to be directed towards fundamentally different goals from those of the post-war era. And quotes like this signal, or in the case of Thatcher, reflect the idea of ideologically changing governments, shaking things up, and making substantial changes to budget expenditures across categories or broad policy areas. And so here are the policy areas. These are the top 8 categories as defined by the International Monetary Fund, and you can break these down within defense. Of course, there's spending in like Army, Navy, that kind of thing. You can break any of these categories down a lot, but it's pretty complicated just to go after these 8 all at once. And keep in mind that before we wrote this, the industry standard has been that people go after one area at a time. We're going after all 8 at once, so we thought that was enough to take on in this particular project. And we've divided these areas into what we consider to be general priorities of the left and the right. So the idea that all else equal, what areas would the left tend to prefer, what areas would the right tend to prefer. You'll notice that there's some overlaps with education and health, and most of this follows from the existing literature, some of which me and my co-authors have written. You'll also notice that religion and culture is not a core priority for either side, and this is an area that we theorize to be kind of a luxury good, that when times are really good, you can put a lot more funding into those that particular category. I think it's also worth noting that for the purposes of what we're doing, we're lumping a lot of things within each of these categories. These are broad categories, and while we might expect left governments and right governments to spend more on religion and culture during times of economic growth, that's one of the expectations that we have. We would fully expect that they're not going to spend on exactly the same things, right? So, I can think of a French government of the left spending a lot of money on a new opera house in Paris. The right in most countries would probably be spending more on churches than the left. So even within these broad categories, there can be huge, within these broad categories, there's huge changes. And kind of a naive model would be that you think, okay, governments have their ideology and the things that are favored by their core supporters. Those would be their general priorities. We know that, of course, budgets move slowly, and so we would expect that past expenditures would have a substantial influence on current expenditures, but we would think, okay, governments will just start changing those things, and over time they should add up. But I think the best quote to the contrary of that is this famous Harold Macmillan quote. He was asked by a reporter what the most difficult problem of his time in office was, and he said, "Events, dear boy, events," because it's just sort of a fancier way of saying stuff happens, right? You get into government, you've got this plan of what you want to do. You've been thinking about these changes while you were while the other party was was in charge, and now you want to change them. And this is just kind of his way of saying policymaking is never done in a vacuum, and events, or what we would say circumstances, shape budgets, sometimes even against the ideological wishes of a majority government. So our theory about expenditure compositions is, of course, much more complicated. And it's this idea that you have these general priorities that come from your ideology and the preferences of your core supporters, but then you might have more or less institutional power. There's electoral considerations, economic circumstances, and then, of course, international circumstances. And so all of that, together with the past expenditure composition, goes into determining the current expenditure composition. And we developed for each of the circumstances or considerations that we looked at, we developed two sets of expectations. One, which we call that there'll be policy-driven changes, ideologically driven changes, but that are still dictated by the circumstances. And the other one is that circumstances overwhelm the ideological priorities. And so this is an example within the economy, and so you kind of have, sorry about that. You have good economic change to the right, bad economic change to the left, or strong economic performance, weak economic performance. And then you can think about emphasis of traditional ideological priorities as being either strong or weak. And these are the four different expectations that we put head to head with our models. And remember, we're doing this with all 8 parts of the composition, where what previous researchers were doing would be, so this is looking at economic affairs spending, which is one of the categories. It's basically business subsidies is the main category here, and it's traditionally been an area favored by the right rather than the left. So instead of modeling that one budget area, which basically that is the equivalent of taking the whole budgetary pie and putting that one slice against everything else. You might find some very interesting relationships, certainly people have over the years, but it's that lumping of everything else together in that blue area. We don't know, how much action there is within that blue area. And what we're doing by modeling all of these 8 components at once is we're saying, all right, let's model the entire pie. Let's look at the trade-offs. So if you're going to increase the orange area, under the previous literature, you're basically just saying you're going to increase it relative to everything else, and we don't know where those increases, where the cuts that offset those increases coming from. It's exactly like Andrew's story. But what we're doing is we're saying, let's look at the whole pie. Let's look at the trade-offs that result. And this is what we call a dynamic pie model, right? Because it's moving dynamically across time. Okay, the first scenario that we ran was we said, okay, you have a left party in power. They have a majority in the lower house of the legislature. Let's leave everything else the same, and the only thing that will change is the ideology of the government. So we'll replace the left majority with a right majority. And one of the things that you notice is that all the green triangles, their lines cross the zero line, meaning that in the first year, there's no statistically significant changes. It's not until we start looking at the long run relationships here in blue that we see that there are lots of significant changes, and they comport very well with the what we would expect: increases in spending on defense and economic affairs. Education, remember, was one of those areas that you could make an argument in either direction, and findings of other research have actually shown there's lots of contradictions in that research. Government administration is a traditional left area, but it's just barely goes down, and not by a lot, although depending on the size of the economy, that little tiny change that's less than 1% still could be the equivalent of billions of dollars. The big shocker here is the huge decline that health takes, and I guess little increase in religion and culture, and a small increase in housing, and that wasn't something we expected. But again, this is in a vacuum where nothing else has changed. Now we're going to get more complicated, and we'll look at a figure for the right and the left when we have a change. First of all, looking at economic growth. So this is during economic good times. We have an increase in economic growth, and we're comparing here a right majority government to a left majority. You'll notice we mostly stick with the majority governments. What we found, which is basically as we expected, is that minority governments are a real model. They're able to make some changes that they want to make, but by definition, if you don't control a majority of the seats in the legislature, it's hard to get your agenda fully passed. And in this particular case, with economic growth, what you'll notice is that there's more similarities than there are differences when we look at the long run effects. Social protection actually gets substantially cut by both types of governments, and you're in a period of an expanding economy, and so there's not as many people with those types of needs. We find, as I mentioned before, this is a circumstance under which both governments increase spending on religion and culture, and generally, just very similar results when we compare the two figures. And again, the caveat that I always want to put into this is that even though they're spending the same amount, or they're increasing spending in a particular category in a similar fashion, what they're doing within that category might be quite different, and that's certainly something interesting to look at. We see some bigger differences between the left and right when we look at what they do in reaction to an increase in unemployment. And the right, under these circumstances, really makes two big changes. One is an increase to spending on education. Thinking back on Margaret Thatcher, she presided over a period of rising unemployment, put a lot of money into job training schemes and other things to try to get people off of the dole and to get them working, and did in fact make cuts to social protection. Of course, that's just one case in our data. The left puts a lot of money in reaction to an unemployment shock into government administration, which is a traditional category favored by the left, and this would involve government workers processing payments and kind of tightening up the machine of government in face of this adversity. Let's see, we'll look at one more here in terms of the effects of increased hostilities, and this is actually increased conflict involvement. And if you think about the countries that we're studying between 1975 and 2010, the conflicts that they're involved with during this era are not existential conflicts. And of course, we think that when your country's being attacked, when you're in a situation like the Ukraine has found itself in, everybody wants to spend more on defense. But even in the kind of smaller conflicts that we see, the countries that we're studying in this present study, we do see that both sides of the aisle spend more on defense. And then we see that they offset it a little bit differently between them, but that was kind of an interesting thing, and there's sort of a little bit of a guns versus butter thing going on with both governments of both types, cutting spending on government administration and social protection, and so overall our dynamic pie models showed that majority governments tended to follow their ideological priorities. As I said, minority governments were really muddled, but we found that when they're facing circumstances, whether they're economic or international, we get kind of a mixture of results. Sometimes the circumstances overwhelm ideological priorities or seem to overwhelm them, and other times there are real trade-offs between them in terms of how they react. And really looking forward to your questions and comments.
So what are the implications of this for policymakers, for people in government who are trying to run a complex budgeting process? Any
I'll let these guys
observations?
You're through. You're done.
Yeah, I've talked a lot.
No.
You had thoughts?
Aren't you allowed to make comments on the implications of law?
No, of course,
I'm
of course.
just joking. I'm just joking.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, so I guess my thoughts are, a lot of times, well, it's kind of the, whoa, okay, I guess my mic is on now. I guess it's almost the expectations of us and of the policymakers. So if you think about the way that we've done this and what our findings show is there's this expectation that when a new government comes in, especially if it's from the other side of the aisle, that we're going to see a lot of change. That we're going to see big shifts in the budgets quickly. And we tend to, and we tend to think this, the politicians tend to kind of promote this. And I think what we're finding is that for both policymakers and for us, that realistically it takes time, and that we don't have these big shifts. Again, this is a pretty big cross countries across time. But what we find in general is that depending on what kind of economy you're coming into, depending on what kind of international situation, you may not be able to make those big, or fulfill those big promises that you were hoping to do. So those big cuts in, maybe in welfare, or those big shifts over to defense instead of welfare. So guns versus butter, as Guy said. So I think it's a very realistic idea of what is possible.
Any other, did you add anything, Guy?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's, on the campaign trail, people make lots of promises, and then they get into government, and it's just really, I mean, you've experienced this. I was a research assistant in the House of Commons, but I saw it even at that level. It's a tough machine to drive, and how you get it to change, it changes slow and incremental.
It is slow and incremental. Thank you. Yes,
I
Andy?
think just to add to both of these comments too, it's not just, Guy, right, talked a lot about these unforeseen events, but, there is some evidence too of like tying the hands of these future governments. And so we found a bunch of, we didn't do this in the book really, but it kind of explains some of these things of like, there's evidence of governments, right, like knowing that they're about to go out of power, basically like running up a deficit just so then the next government that comes in, right, it's not even unforeseen things, like they have to kind of undo all the bad things that the previous government did. And you obviously see that a lot with legislation too. So it's not just, it's the economy, it's also policy.
James Q. Wilson, who I had many years ago, said that once you establish a benefit, it's very difficult to cut it back, regardless of who is in office.
Yeah.
Because people get very upset if any changes are made that cut the benefits that they get. And 63 or 64% of the federal budget are entitlement programs. So,
Yeah.
it's also, is it not a factor of whether there's a presidential administration or a parliamentary system? Was there a difference, or did you not test that?
So in the current context, we didn't test that because we don't have that many presidential administrations. It's certainly something you could look at.
It's just France and the United States?
And Finland.
And Finland,
Yeah.
oh, interesting. Okay. So, let me get the questions here. Did your model fit all countries equally well? Is the European budgeting system truly similar to Japan or the US budgeting? Any comments on that?
I'm gonna look over at you.
I don't know how much, outlier detection and things we were doing, but I mean, I think in general, right, like our theory basically fits to all these mostly industrialized countries pretty equally. I do think, right, like the parliamentary presidential thing could be a difference, but no, I don't think there were any sort of cases that seemed like outliers or ones that we couldn't use. Originally when we were kind of going through the data, there were certainly some of the data that we had were in more developing countries, and I think that's where there really could be a difference that you might observe, and certainly different pressures on certain things.
Well, checks and balances, the other thing that makes it hard to increase or reduce is the checks and balances in the system. The one thing that I learned in budgeting I was in the House of Representatives in Massachusetts for 12 years when I was a very young man. And I was in the Ways and Means Committee for 8 of the 12 years, and they controlled, of course, the state budget. And what was most interesting is that whenever the governor would propose, regardless of party, because the Democrats, at least when I was in power, the governors were all Democrats, and the legislature was 80% Democratic. They would dump the governor's budget in the wastebasket and completely rewrite it. The same thing happened when I was in Washington. I was running a federal agency, and I at first thought we had to spend a lot of time on the development of our budget proposal that would go to OMB, and the president would then submit it to Congress. And the staff said, Andrew, it's a huge amount of work. They dump the whole thing in the wastebasket when it gets there. It's the same thing that happened in the state. And the Congress rewrote it, would rewrite based on what their priorities were.
That's what Guy and I were actually talking about this afternoon. He's like, what are those, those budget books? And it's like, yeah, they're the things that, they bring in these big trolleys and they put everywhere in Congress, and then they just end up lying around.
We could save a huge amount of time and effort, just dump them all and flatline the budget with maybe a cost of living increase for everyone. You never want to admit you're doing things that way, but
Yeah.
that's what eventually happens a lot of times. Okay.
I will say, the one thing that I think we could possibly speak to a little bit of that would be the majority-minority aspect that we have. That does show that if you do have more players in the system, it does make it so complicated to actually succeed in doing what you want and filling those preferences. So I think we get a taste of that, especially given that we have mostly parliamentary systems.
Yeah.
So I would anticipate that if we move to a bunch of presidential, the divided government aspect would come into play. Yeah, I think so.
What constitutes a long versus short run in your analysis?
Right. These are time series models, and as we
Explain what a time series model is.
okay, so you have data across time for the same unit, and here the unit is the country, and these are annual data, and so it's very common practice to think that the past value affects the present value, and then the most immediate past value is determined by the previous past, or at least in part by the previous past, and that means that the effect of any change, you end up estimating essentially a system, and the effect of any change has both a short and a long run effect. And in our models, with the size of the estimates that we had, it's about 5 years for the long run changes to take effect. But it's all built on this kind of artificial, well, it is an artificial exercise where we're saying only this one thing changes, and how, how would that play out across time? But that's the whole point of estimating these, is to isolate the effect of one
The
thing.
one big change you said, and people are wondering why we at the Scowcroft Institute even sponsored this book. It's because it's between countries. It's an international study. It's not just a U.S. study. But secondly, I was intrigued with the fact that you looked at defense budgets. Senator Gore in 2000 promised to increase the defense budget and spend more internationally. George Bush actually promised less, but he ended up spending more because of 9/11, which no one anticipated, at all, other than Osama bin Laden, of course. What about the size of the pie, big or small? Do some governments, left or right, borrow more, and how does the borrowing affect the composition?
Yeah, so I can answer this. So this is not the first pie sort of project we've been on, and some of the other ones that Guy and I have been on. This is a really common question of don't you need to account for the total size of whatever we're looking at? So here it's total budgets. Other ones we looked at were inequality, right? Kind of the proportion of incomes and how it's allocated, or vote shares. So in countries outside the U.S., there's more than 2 parties, and looking at those. And so we've always tried to account for this, and we've always been told by lots of people you should. And it does, right? It always seems to matter statistically, but substantively it's such a small effect. So I don't think we've ever really seen it ever changing the relationship between the categories, in our case of spending. It doesn't matter whether it's getting bigger or smaller. What does that really mean? It means that if the budget went up by $1 billion, that's getting effectively proportioned in the same proportion as to what we had before. Yeah, with the debt part though, that's interesting. I mean, we didn't include debt in the compositional models.
There's deficit, which is short run
Right.
change to
Yeah.
debt. Yeah.
Yeah. But and I think we're very clear also when we are comparing those budgets, and we're talking about left and right and those types of changes. So if they are changing it and they're increasing or decreasing, I think we're very clear about how that doesn't mean that the right is spending necessarily more. It's that the change is
Percentage-wise.
percentage. And so I think in the book we're pretty clear on that, because that could definitely be read that the left, the left is spending more on social protection and that would get everybody kind of weight that's, so. I think
Yeah.
That's also really important.
I actually was intrigued when I was writing this introduction to George H.W. Bush's foreign policy. I edited a book with Andy Card of essays written by the people who ran foreign policy. So Condi Rice wrote a chapter, Jim Baker wrote a chapter, Richard Haas, and it was interesting to edit it. But I wrote the introduction to it, and I was looking up vetoes. George Bush vetoed more spending bills than any American president in the last 50 years. Actually, more than that, I think. And Donald Trump didn't veto any spending bills. But people think of him as far more right-wing, and George Bush is more of a moderate. But from a fiscal perspective, George Bush was the most conservative president in the sense of trying to keep expenditures down. It was really quite interesting to look at now, someone pointed out, of course Bush did, because he had Democrats in control of the Congress.
Right.
And I don't remember I thought Trump lost control after the biennial election, the second election for Congress. He did.
After the
didn't
midterm.
he?
Yeah.
After the midterm. But he still didn't veto bills. He just signed them. Now, you could say COVID had an effect. That certainly did to some degree. But anyway, are there other questions from the audience anybody has? Thank you all for coming this evening.
Oh, I think we
Oh,
have.
We
one
have-
more. Yes, sir.
Can you define social protection? What's included there?
Right.
Yeah, we should pull up that
Do you want
slide.
the
Yeah,
slide?
I'm sure
I
other
actually
people
have
are
a slide
interested.
for that.
It's defined by the IMF. So,
Welfare program is
So
it's-
right.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
a lot of people would say education, you know.
sick,
is a-
disabled,
Is that a
old
social
age
protection,
survivors,
really?
No,
families and
no, it's
children,
not.
and
Right, it's not.
unemployment.
Yeah.
Got it.
Food stamps would be included, would it not be?
Yes.
Social Security? Medicaid?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes,
Well,
this is very,
Medicaid, I'm not sure that might be in health.
No, this is,
You used
Yeah.
This is IMF.
IMF
IMF.
definitions?
The
It's-
COFOG.
it is, it depends on how the country has budgeted their social security,
Ah.
on whether or not it's off budget or, yeah.
Ours is
That-
off budget
that-
theoretically.
Yeah, so it definitely depends. So, most of them would not include social security and social protection.
Would food stamps would be included?
Food
though.
stamps.
I would think so, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they try to harmonize it so that the measure means the same thing across countries in the same year, but also over time. So that's why these data were really ideal for our purposes.
And that would be only public spending too.
Yeah.
So, because it's government budget.
Other final questions? Thank you for coming this evening. and
Thank you.
presenting.
Thank you so much.